the Associate Vice President for Mission and Ministry, and on off days, I'm the Associate College Treasurer. I'm also the Chair of the Smith Fellowship Selection Committee and Director of the Smith Fellowship Program. This past summer, we were able to send 11 Providence College students, rising juniors and seniors, around the world. We had 3 who were in South America, and we're going to hear from one of them this afternoon, Kathleen Mcgreal, whose parents and grandfather are here with us, just to make sure she does it right. She was in Banos de Agua Santa, holy water, in Ecuador, and she was with the Dominican friars of the Vice Province of Ecuador, participating in their various ministries there. We also had Julia Guerret, who was working with the Dominican Sisters of Grand Rapids, Michigan, in their ministries in Chimbote, Peru, principally a maternity clinic. And we had a third one who was in, Maggie Schmidt, who was in Tucumán, Argentina. And she worked with the Dominican Sisters of Tucumán. And unfortunately, she's studying in Florence this semester. Some PC kids never stay home. And so she won't be able to make a presentation. We had one student in Dublin, Ireland, Kate Jorgensen. It was the One Study Fellowship, and Kate will be making her presentation following Kathleen's. We had 2 students, Joseph Day and Jenna Donahue, who worked with the Dominican Friars in Springs outside of Johannesburg, South Africa. They made their presentation last evening. Emily LaBattaglia went to a little place a couple hours outside of Manila and worked in an orphanage run by the Dominican Sisters of St. Joseph, a native Philippine Dominican Sisters congregation. Now we had 2 students go into Sydney, Australia primarily, but also Newcastle and Canberra. Elizabeth Nako was one of those 2, along with Renee Altamari. They're going to be making their presentations tomorrow evening. That's correct. And then we had 2 students spend time in Sydney, Australia, and then go on to the Solomon Islands, where Bishop Chris Cardone, a member of our province of the Dominicans, a 1980 graduate of Providence College, a native of Long Island, he went off as a young priest to the Solomon Islands and has spent the rest of his priestly life going from island to island. And he looks pretty funny in his cutoffs, t-shirt, and mitre. But we do have a picture of that. Those were our fellows this year. We asked them to return to Providence College and as payback to make a presentation to the community. Now, anytime we schedule something like that at Providence College, everyone else is scheduling something too. It turns out there's a career fair going on for seniors, and now the president of the college has decided someone's going to dump a bucket of water over his head at 5:15. So we have people dealing with the water buckets. But the quality people are here, and I thank you for being with us this afternoon. So I'm going to ask Kathleen to make her presentation.
Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kathleen Mcgreal, and I am a senior English and sociology major. This summer, I had the opportunity to travel to Banos de Agua Santa in Ecuador, where I lived and served for 6 weeks. And as I'm sure many of the other Smith Fellows will tell you, this was definitely one of the most incredible experiences of my life. At the risk of sounding cliche, I feel like this was one of those shaping moments in your life, you know, that you only get to experience once in a great while. And I feel truly blessed to have been granted such an incredible and amazing opportunity. Okay. So you might be thinking, why Banos, Ecuador? You may not have heard of it. It's a pretty small town slash city, smack dab in the middle of the country of Ecuador. So when I was first examining locations that I could do service, I got in contact with Sister Lucia Fernandez, who is a part of Dominican Volunteers International, based out of Rome. And what Dominican Volunteers International is a network of volunteers around the globe serving in various Dominican communities. And usually the service with Dominican Volunteers International is a full year, but I was lucky enough that Sister Lucia made an exception in my case and let me serve for the 6 weeks that I was there. One of the other things that drew me to Banos was the fact that there was a community of Dominican volunteers. Like I said with DVI, there's volunteers around the world, and in each location, there's several volunteers. I was lucky enough to live and work with 4 other volunteers, and 2 of them with whom I worked quite closely. And I also knew that teaching English as a second language was something I wanted to at least incorporate into my service, if it couldn't be the main service that I did. I've been involved with English as a second language through campus ministry for over a year now, and it's just been one of those service experiences that has really changed my life, and I know, if possible, this is something that I'd like to do in the future. So that was a huge draw for me as well. And so when Sister Lucia told me that teaching English would be part of my service, I knew immediately that this was something that I really would like to do. And finally, Ecuador is a country with a rich Roman Catholic history and tradition, and I knew that this was a place that could make my time in service incredible. Okay. So living in Banos, when I was there, I lived in a location called El Centro de Formación Cristiana. Basically what it was a retreat house, and I had my own room, and it was run by the incredible Sister Maria Elena. She made sure that I was fed and that I was safe, and with the help of Juan, who also helped to run the center, they taught me the customs and the traditions of Ecuador and Banos. They helped me get around the city at the beginning, and they also made sure that I got to school safely every day. And I couldn't have done what I did without Sister Maria Elena and Juan. My second home, although I wasn't living there, was called La Casa de la Sagrada Familia. That was where the other DVI volunteers lived. So the first volunteer who lived there was Mariana. She was only 18 years old. She was from Mexico, and she spoke English fluently. There was also Mariela. She was 27 years old. She was a former history teacher and social worker from Bolivia. And finally was Eddie and Gilda. They were a married couple from Guatemala, and they were psychologists, and they offered their services to the people of Banos. And finally, my last home, my third home while I was in Banos, was with the Dominican Sisters of the Immaculate Conception. Their convent and their school, Sagrada Corazon, was where I spent the large majority of my time. I was there 5 days a week from 8 o'clock in the morning until about 5 o'clock at night. And the sisters were some of the most incredible people I've ever met in my life. They were so selfless, and they were always thinking of others before themselves. So I couldn't have asked for better people to have done my main service with. And I just have a few pictures up here of some of my homes that I had while I was in Banos. You can see up in the top left is El Centro de Formación Cristiana, where I lived. Up at the top right, you see Tunguragua. That is the active volcano that is in Banos. And I could see it right from my window when it wasn't covered by fog. It was often very cloudy and rainy there. In the bottom left-hand corner, you see Mariana, myself, and Mariela. That's one of our last dinners together, so it was kind of a bittersweet moment. Mariela cooked traditional Bolivian food for me as a send-off present. And finally, in the bottom right, it's myself with Sister Teresa. She was the principal of the school where I worked, and also Sister Rosana and Sister Rosa Maria. So they were also teachers and administrators at the school where I worked. Like I've said, when I was in Banos, my main service was teaching English. Each day from 8:30 to 1:30, I helped assistant teach with the advanced level English teacher at the school. So though the school ranged from grades K through 10, so your ages 4 through 15 or 16, I mainly worked with the upper level students, grades 7 through 10. So each day I would help with their classes and sometimes even run their classes myself. But in addition, I had afternoon classes that were completely independently run by me. I had 2 hours every afternoon to teach a different grade level. So for example, Mondays I taught 7th grade for 2 hours. It was sort of like an after-school program that the sisters instituted because I was there and I was a native English speaker. Because they think it's part of the mission of the school is to learn English. It's ingrained in the mission statement of the school. So they thought that the students could benefit even from some more extra practice. So each week I would focus on all 3 components: reading, writing, speaking. But in particular, I focused on writing because I felt that that's sort of the basic component. And if you can write the language, it's easier to speak it. So I would try to work one-on-one with the students when I could in these large group settings and work on their writing and perfecting the grammar and things like that. And each week I would have a certain theme to all my classes, such as what is your favorite movie? And I would have them write about that, or where do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do when you grow up? And some of the most rewarding work for me was spending one-on-one time with the students, especially the ones who could be a little bit, noisy in class and not paying attention, because when I really got to spend time with them and sit down and help them and talk to them and help them independently, you really learned how intelligent and how hard they were willing to work. And that was really rewarding, especially when, you could get the class clown to sit down and listen to you. And I was also incredibly impressed because a number of students had actually taught themselves English by watching television, by watching American television series, which I couldn't believe. They weren't fluent, but they were pretty close to it, and that was really inspiring to me. And you can just see, there's some pictures, that's me teaching, and then that's the outside of the school with the courtyard and the basketball hoops and all the classrooms up at the top and on the bottom floor. And these are just some of the pictures I took near the end of my time. So right before I was leaving, I took a picture with each of my classes. You can see in the top, it's my 8th grade class, then my 9th grade class, my 7th grade class, and my 10th grade class. And they all made me cards. I have a stack of cards like this big from all my students, which definitely was very touching because the things they wrote were very sweet. Okay, so in addition to teaching English, I was also involved with other services as well. Like I said, I was involved with the community of DVI volunteers, and so their main work was not teaching English at the school. They had a number of responsibilities with which I was able to help out and sort of become involved with myself. One of the main things that I was able to do was help with youth groups. There was a weekly youth group on Thursday nights at the church, at the Basilica, and so I would help with that when I was free, when I wasn't teaching afternoon classes. And I also had the ability to travel with Mariana and Mariela to local places like San Francisco, which is a local town. When I say local, I mean it's at least an hour by bus through the mountains, because the church in Banos likes to spread ministry to these surrounding towns that do not have necessarily a permanent priest or sister working there. And I also was able to be a have guest appearances on the radio show, which Mariana and Mariela ran. Their radio show was called Jóvenes en Acción, which means Youth in Action, and it was a Christian music radio program for kids and teenagers, and it ran from 2 to 3 each afternoon. So I had the ability to pop in a few times, and contribute to the discussion of the day. They'd have different themes every week, like the Holy Spirit or treating others with respect. So it was kind of things like that. One of the other great things I had the opportunity to do was travel with with the other DVI volunteers. So Movimiento Juvenil Dominicano took place over a full weekend, and it was held in Catamayo, which is in the southern part of the country. We were practically in Peru by the time we got there. And it was a 14-hour journey each way, but it was absolutely an incredible experience because I was able to see these young people who were so driven by faith and so willing to give up their entire weekend just to be there with other Dominican youth. It was absolutely an incredible experience. And finally, I have English lessons again, but these were more impromptu English lessons. I actually would schedule time every week, and I would work with Mariela, who was from Bolivia. She wanted to improve her English, so I would work with her on reading and speaking. So that was some other service that I had the opportunity to participate in. I just have a few photos here. Up the top 2 photos are from that weekend, the Dominican Youth Movement. You can see that was one of the activities, and that's the whole group that traveled from Banos with me. And down at the bottom, you have a picture from one of the youth groups, Thursday night youth groups, and then that's one of our youth groups in San Francisco, excuse me. Okay. I also wanted to touch briefly upon spiritual life in Ecuador and Banos more specifically. I was thinking about it, and to me, Catholicism is what I would call a very visible and visual religion in Ecuador. Everywhere you look, there's beautiful cathedrals, in Quito particularly, beautiful cathedrals, ornately decorated, beautiful artwork, even in homes. So I thought that was a really interesting aspect of Christianity and Catholicism more specifically in Ecuador. I have up here devotion to the Virgin Mary. So basically, Banos de Agua Santa, holy water, like Father Rob said, is directly related to a vision of Mary that appeared at a waterfall in Banos. And there's a grotto there in honor of Mary, and that's the picture on the left right there. It's kind of grainy, but you can see there's a lot of respect and reverence for Mary. And additionally, I wanted to touch upon how Mass was different in Ecuador. It was an incredibly different experience than the United States. You know, when you go to Mass here, everyone's very quiet. There's a different sort of atmosphere than I found in Banos. It was very noisy. It was very loud. There were lots of people. They were carrying statues of Mary and pictures of Mary to have blessed. And it was a little bit frightening, but it was also incredible at the same time. And finally, I wanted to talk about, like I said, the youth of Banos. I was incredibly inspired by the deep faith of the people in Banos, especially the young people. There was one girl named Kaylee, and she was maybe only 12 years old, and she would attend every youth group, every choir meeting. She went to every rosary meeting we had during the month of May for the month of Mary, and she even ran her own youth group, which I found absolutely amazing. So these are just a few pictures of the church in Banos, the basilica, and you can see the altar was incredibly ornately decorated with red and gold. And then this is a picture in Quito. It's called La Vergen De Quito and El Panecillo, which means loaf of bread. It references the sort of mountain or hill that it's not even a statue, it's actually a museum that the museum is on. So you can, like I said, it's very visible and very visual. And finally, I want to talk briefly about the challenges. I mean, with any endeavor or any service, there were definitely challenges. The Spanish language was something that I'd been removed from for a little bit, so that was a little bit unnerving. It was obviously the first time I'd lived in a foreign country for an extended period of time. I was teaching on my own to these children for the first time, really. I had a classroom of 25 every day that I had to manage on my own. But despite those challenges, it was a very rewarding experience. This service definitely solidified my desire to continue with this kind of service work in the future in some shape or form, even after graduation. And Sister Lucia, she communicated with with me by email quite frequently, and she told me to trust in the Lord and everything would work out, and it did. And I'm incredibly grateful to her advice. She was great in reassuring me when I was nervous. The second line I have is a line from the Peace Prayer of St. Francis. It was something I reflected on a lot when I was doing my applications for the Smith Fellowship. My high school was Franciscan, so it was something that I was reflecting on. And it says, "For it is in giving that we receive." And when I first saw that line, I was thinking about it. It was a little bit confusing at first, but then I realized what it meant. It was something I'd never thought about before. When we give our whole selves to service, our bodies, our minds, our spirits, then that's when we are truly blessed by God. And that was something I definitely felt when I was in Ecuador and participating in service. And the final quote I have is, "God has been good with the people he puts into my life." That's actually a quote from Mariana. She told that to me. And I would like to echo her sentiment. Without Mariana and Mariela, I would have been lost. And they were my spiritual rocks and my emotional rocks my whole time. So I'm incredibly grateful to them for that. Okay. And I just have a few pictures of some of the important people. Not all of the important people, but some of the important people I was with while I was in Banos. So, you can see Mariela, that little boy in the corner. That's Dylan. He was a little boy who took a liking to me. He was the son of a woman who worked at the radio. And yes, these are just people I'll never be able to forget, and I hope to go back and see sometime in the near future, hopefully. And finally, this presentation wouldn't be complete without an expression of gratitude. First, I would like to thank Father Rob most profusely. I couldn't have done it without you, and you made everything possible. You were there as a guidance and as a support system all through the application process. So I thank you for that. I would also like to thank the entire Father Smith Selection Committee and Father Pravarnik for agreeing to let me go to Ecuador and for their support as well. I would like to thank Sister Lucia of DVI. Again, she made the exception for me, and it wouldn't have been possible without her. And finally, to all my friends in Ecuador, in Banos, in Mexico, and Bolivia, I'd like to thank them for accepting me and welcoming me into their community. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathleen. Wonderful presentation. She actually captured everything that we look for in one of these, including her reflections at the end. Would anyone have any questions of Kathleen? We're going to be really shifting gears here. So, has Kathleen made it crystal clear? And do we have others that are ready to sign up? Do they want people to come back, Kathleen?
I think they do. They said the priors there said that they'd be incredibly grateful to have.
Okay, good. So,
Volunteers there. So if anyone that's out there in the audience is thinking about out there, it was an incredible experience. And they have a rotating community of volunteers. So it wouldn't be Mariana and Mariela, but Eddie and Gilda have been there for almost 3 years now, so they may still be there next year. So I would highly recommend going there if you're thinking about self-immersion.
anyone? Thanks, Kathleen, very much. Preparing to speak now is Kate Jorgensen, who is now a senior at Providence College. She was the only one who undertook a study fellowship rather than a service one. And she contacted the Dominican friars in Dublin, Ireland, and was able to put together, through their assistance and the assistance of the Dominican Sisters of Cabra, in Ireland, a 6-week program. She'll tell you about it. She was digging into 2 rather obscure Dominican poets from 300 or 400 years ago, and a more famous Jesuit one, Gerard, Manley, Hopkins. So, and then her parents went over, and they, as it goes, they did Ireland. So, Kate, it's all yours.
Father Rob said this is payback time, so I'm not sure he meant that ironically, but it certainly is in a way. So feel free when I start blathering and you're feeling a bit bored to just look at the pretty pictures, because while I'm not certain of my skill as a public speaker, I'm reasonably certain of my skill as a photographer. So feel free to do that. Before I present my presentation, I would like to express my gratitude to Providence College and all the people who enabled the Father Smith Fellowships, not least of all our Dominican friars. Further, I would like to thank in absentia the Dominican friars of St. Saviour's and the Dominican Sisters of Cabra in Dublin. A year ago, I wrote in my application essay that I hope to bear witness and to spread the beautiful saving words of Christ. I came that they may have life and have it more abundantly, and felt that if I might spread a spark of that divine fire, the desire to seek what is good and true and beautiful, even unwittingly, as a result of my fellowship, I believe that I would have done well. Thanks to the kindness of many and the grace of God, I believe that I have succeeded in doing that. In the beginning weeks of July, when I sat down to do research on Father Vergen Hassied, OP, in the lovely Central Catholic Library, I thought myself up to the task. Then, in a blitz of research, I discovered that I was not. Much to my surprise, I had been chasing one man when I ought to have been chasing two: Vergen Hassied and Patrick Hackett. This, in the scheme of things, seems an error easily rectifiable, yet I will admit it bothered me. Not because I had made a mistake, though I had, but because I had assumed. My mind so fixated and so narrow that my sight was blinded and I had gotten lost. The matter of finding myself was simply broadening my vision. But it was not simply my mistake, because you see, the modern Irish writer, following a precedent set by Tague O'Donoghue in the 1920s, have always referred to Father Hassied by his Irish name. Before 1918, he is referred to as Patrick Hackett. After 1918, he is referred to as Padraig Hassied. It is easy to see why. Hassied was in his own century, the 17th century, much concerned with the freedom of his beloved Ireland. He wrote poems about that freedom, criticizing those who would not fight for it and honoring those who did. It is in this patriotic political aspect that modern Ireland has come to know him. As a political figure, nominally Catholic, as 17th century Ireland was, but much more concerned with freeing Ireland, and so they treat him, and so they refer to him by his Irish name only. In some of the texts he is referred to, it is difficult to tell that he is a priest, much less a Dominican. This reflects not simply a mistake, but a conscious overlooking of faith, an outlook which has begun to finally overtake Ireland, even as it has overtaken the rest of the West. Nowhere is it more clear than in the study of great literature that scholars have forgotten the ultimate importance of beauty, truth, and goodness, and nowhere more appalling. To be ignorant is forgivable, but to be proud of ignorance is damning. In my paper, then, I will be reflecting on the three priest poets of my fellowship: Father Vergen Hassied, OP, of the 17th century, Father Gerard Manley Hopkins of the 19th, and Father Paul Murray, OP, of the 21st, and how their Catholicism is an irrevocable part of their beings, and how to erase or to overlook that is to miss an essential part of not only them, but the meaning and depth of their work as poets. So, Vergen Hassied, OP, also known as Patrick Hackett, was a 17th century Irish Dominican father who was renowned for both causing trouble and writing poetry, where those two things are more connected than you might guess. He was born in Tipperary in 1604 to a prominent Old English family, a second son, and entered the Order of Limerick in 1627, but would actually spend most of his life in France, in exile. In 1638, he returned to Ireland and brokered peace after the rebellion of 1641. Between 1641 and 1651, he was made prior and chief preacher at Cashel. But by 1651, he was again obliged to flee to France, where he spent the remaining 3 years of his life in exile, fighting for Ireland, the Irish Dominicans, and his poetry, dying in Lough in November 1654 at the age of 50. It is pertinent to note here Fenning's research into the 17th century Irish Dominicans, who notes that at the time of his death, Hesiod was under trial to be excommunicated. His was a tumultuous life indeed. If, however, you should consult any number of 20th and 21st century scholars about why Hesiod seems such a contradictory figure, brilliant and eloquent, but exiled by the very church he served, they would have a singular answer: politics. They use Hesiod's life and his poetry to prove all sorts of things about the political tensions in Ireland, but mainly on the church and the Irish aristocracy, how they fought and what they did, without considering the actual meaning of what they are saying. In particular, they take note of Hesiod's poetry around the rebellion of 1641 as entirely pro-Irish, pro-nuncio rhetoric, without taking a chance to pause on the subtleties of it. The rebellion of 1641 was an uprising led by the Catholic aristocracy of Ireland, who attempted to seize control of the English Protestant government in order to relieve Catholics living under Protestant rule. It failed and dissolved into a series of ethnic conflicts which are known as the Irish Confederate Wars. In tracking the politics of the rebellion of 1641, however, scholars who use Hesiod tend to egregiously simplify his poetry. As a representative example, I will present Paul Gibney, who notes in his book Shadows of a Year, the 1641 rebellions in Irish history and memory, that while contemporary poets writing in the 1640s, such as Padraig and Hesiod, had sought to justify the Irish, or at least the Irish nobility's rising in 1641, they did not dwell on the specifics of what happened. I would note, however, in the poem to which Gibney refers, a single representative stanza that notes, "Since the land has risen, each man should do his damnedest to keep his property and head from being taken by this rabble." Clearly, to Gibney, this sort of thing is not specifics, nor when Hesiod predicts the consequences of failure, for if they come here again, that terrible gang of aliens with their soundest, choicest troops, Erie no longer will be Erie. But even this does not cut to the heart of the matter, because for Hesiod, the whole point of the uprising was not to establish the Irish aristocracy again, even so much as he loved them, and he did, but that Ireland would be Ireland again, to prevent an eclipsing of their faith. It is the God of grace he invokes at the end of the poem, where it is the Holy Cross who protects Ireland's race. This, for Hesiod, is what makes Ireland Ireland. But it is not merely in misquoting Hesiod that the danger lies, but twisting his meanings altogether. We could consider Ollemeyer's book, Ireland from Independence to Occupation, 1641 to 1660, who says that Hesiod condemned the anti-nuncio Confederates as secularists who put the affairs of state above those of the church, as heretics. Hesiod did condemn the anti-nuncio Confederates as apostates and excommunicates for reneging on their precious faith. But the bias with which Ollemeyer expresses it is an entirely different matter. For Ollemeyer, religion is not only not as important as concerns of state, but in reality irrelevant. It is utterly incomprehensible to her that allegiance to the nuncio, and thereby adherence to religious doctrine, should even enter into questions of affairs of state. Ollemeyer concludes by saying that Hesiod reduced the complex question of allegiance into one simple pro or anti-nuncio equation, and thereby deliberately dismissed the abstractions of state and reason of state as an unworthy rationale. Clearly, rather than taking the time to consider the merit of Hesiod's argument in his poetry, she regards it as incomprehensible and the sort of intellectual oversimplification which haunts certain types of religion. Ironically enough, though, it is she who is oversimplifying. Is it not much clearer to say that Hesiod, who understood the true end of mankind, could not see a way by which disregarding that end would benefit man, even temporarily? I need only turn to the last poem that Hesiod ever wrote, which was addressing the fact that the church had banned the Irish clergy from writing in Irish Gaelic. And as a prominent Irish poet-priest himself, he clearly felt betrayed. The last stanza runs that I will stitch up my mouth with a twisted string and say no word about their mean complaining, merely condemn the herd of narrow censors and the hate they bear my people. oh my God. There are two major translations of the work within the last 2 decades, where I have quoted Thomas Kinsella's, which I feel better describes the subtleties of Hesiod's work. If you had heard Hartnett's, you might have assumed that Hesiod was being excommunicated for good reason, for it is the sort of selfish, vitriolic verse of a translation which fits in nicely with the image of Hesiod as a patriot and political above all else. But I would note that in Kinsella's, when Hesiod beseeches, oh my God, he is not simply asking for death, but to condemn, which is not the same thing entirely. Here is the poet's request for judgment, not merely victory for this side or that. But he has already told us of the weight of this betrayal, that the clerics are a herd of narrow censors, where narrow is derogatory, particularly compared to the subtle paths of Gaelic. And here we return to Hesiod's life, who wrote no more poetry for 3 years after until his death, and who, while he did protest to his superiors in private, was obedient to them in public. This, perhaps, is not so far from the Dominican and Catholic ideal, obedient but mindful of justice and of the truth. If only history had portrayed him as such. But fortunately for Hesiod, he is saved from most scholarly manipulations because he is relatively obscure, at least outside of Ireland. However, the next poet of my study is not quite so lucky. While I am certain that all here are present with the looming figure of Father Gerard Manley Hopkins, S.J., I would note a few small biographical details. He is arguably the most famous Victorian poet, and certainly the most famous Jesuit one, and a convert of the Oxford movement. Of the approximate decade that he spent as a priest before his death in 1889, Hopkins would spend most of his time either teaching or as a parish priest, and would, in fact, spend the last years of his life in ill health teaching at the University of College Dublin as a classics professor, dying in Dublin and being buried in Glasnevin Cemetery, which is only a few miles north of the center of Dublin, actually. While he was in Ireland, Hopkins wrote a number of poems which became known as the Terrible Sonnets because of their dark nature. For Hopkins, in many ways, the consummate Englishman and a convert from Anglicanism, fit poorly in Ireland, and his disposition, which tended to the melancholy, was not improved by his surroundings. But because Hopkins is so famous, and so deservedly so, academics of all sorts have written about him. But while the quantity with which Hopkins is written about does not flag, the quality certainly does. While I could wade through the criticism of Hopkins over the past century, and there is a great deal of it, I assure you, I will confine my remarks to the International Gerard Manley Hopkins Festival, which I had the privilege to attend as part of my fellowship. This, then, may constitute a representative sample of precisely what is wrong with Hopkins scholarship in specific and trends in scholarship in general. Take, for example, a gentleman named Capella, who addressed his remarks on Hopkins in Pied Beauty, that he made note of the psychological approaches to spirituality, where it almost seems an injustice to Hopkins to quote him in defense. But should we turn to Pied Beauty, for example, which praises God for dappled things and all things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, it does appear that the psychology of spirituality is irrelevant. This is the praise of the properties of being, where it is creation and the creator Hopkins is praising. The connection is almost painfully not there. Or we could refer to Parka, who attempted to produce a disability framework to the Terrible Sonnets in order to demonstrate what she called was Hopkins' bipolar disorder. Again, the injustice is done to Hopkins in the name of scholarship, and we need only look at Hopkins to resolve the matter. While the Terrible Sonnets are dark in tone, the darkness of their tone is not a psychological disorder, but rather a symptom of spiritual dryness. When Hopkins says, "And I wake and feel the dark of day," that I am gall, I am heartburn, God's most deep decree, bitter would have me taste, my taste was me, Hopkins is not referring to a mental disorder, but rather the scrupulous reflections of a deeply religious man who fears that to be lost is to be his own sweating self, but worse. The obvious religious symbolism and doctrine here must be overlooked or twisted to say anything at all about a bipolar disorder. I could mention a lecture on Hopkins and Matisse, or Hopkins and Baudelaire, or even the lecture on the views of rural space in English poetry. But it pains me to do so, and I believe the point is already well made. that scholars are more likely to impress their own readings onto Hopkins than to draw out the importance of what Hopkins is actually saying. This is, of course, a readily explainable phenomena in current academic circles. Because Hopkins is of such importance, and his poetry and his diaries deal so explicitly with matters of faith, scholars must be blind to his texts in order to produce their own readings. This is a double injustice, not only because they are misreading Hopkins, but because they are also missing the truly extraordinary things about him. I will return to Pied Beauty and note of the line that I had just quoted, the importance of the comma semicolon section of lines 7 through 9, pairing as they do opposites into a whole, so that swift is coupled to slow, sweet to sour, and a dazzle to dim. The beauty that the poet is praising is all things counter, original, spare, and strange, so that ordinary things of the world become extraordinary in the sight of the poet. This pairing of opposites into a single whole is by nature a paradox, but that paradox only points to a greater one. Aside from the wonder of it and the awesome joy, it expresses an extraordinary vision of the mystery of the Incarnation and the Eucharist, the truly jaw-droppingly stupendous reality of the pairing of opposites and paradox, and the mystery of how mundane is made divine. Truly, when one considers Hopkins in this light, can one do justice to him any other way? Lastly, I will turn to the last poet of my fellowship, Father Paul Murray, O.P. He is a modern poet, and it was P.C.'s good fortune to have him as a guest lecturer last year on the poetry of Shakespeare, where I had the chance to hear him lecture, which was notable not only for the depth of his understanding as a scholar, but also as a poet. He is a native of Newcastle, entered the Dominican Order in 1966, and currently teaches the literature of mysticism at the Angelicum in Rome. He's written a number of books, but I will mention here his books of poetry, Rites and Meditations, The Absent Fountain, These Black Stars, and his book from 1991, which is a very fascinating discussion of mysticism and T.S. Eliot's four quartets. And while the notable time difference in the publication of these is reflected in the difference of style and technique, I will here consider them in general for the sake of not boring you to tears. Rites and Meditations was published in 1972, and some years later, when it was selected as a choice volume in the Poetry Ireland Review, the editor Jordan, aside from critiquing the effectiveness of Murray's style as verse rather than prose, notes that in the second part, which is called Meditations, that Murray's verse is a little bit too Eliot-esque to make a fresh impact. As I have said, at the time Murray had begun to write his book on Eliot mysticism, and as one who has written under the influence of Eliot myself, recognize that there is perhaps a legitimate criticism of Murray's verse here, and it is certainly something that Murray himself is aware, noting that it would embarrass and put to shame these 10 short meditations to put underneath them, as it were, in footnotes, the names of poets whose lives and works one cannot hope to emulate. But I believe that Jordan is too glib here, because the Eliot that Murray's verse harkens back to is not the Eliot of Prufrock and the Wasteland, but the Eliot who wrote the four quartets, whose explicit nature as religious poetry is obvious to those who look. In this line of mystical poetry, Murray's work is even more explicitly religious than Eliot, so that in a world which is post-Christian, the third meditation answers this question well. That when Murray says, "With those friends who disclaim all knowledge of God, I boast and I say I know him. And I say I am speaking from my own experience, but my friends say, be reasonable. How can you know him? How can you be so sure that you are not self-deceived? This question I know is honest, and I know its demands. For an answer not those obscure words about experience, but the clear evidence of a man's life. However, I will say it here again, and even to my own doubting heart, and to my own 5 agnostic senses, I know him." Ironically enough, in Harman's review of The Absent Fountain in the Irish University Review, he notes that the striking and traditional Christian insights, which are conveyed directly with startling, minimal simplicity, he also makes a point of picking out and commenting on a poem called Ulster Relics by saying that at a time when poets search about for ways in which to comment on political violence, in Ulster Relics, Murray turns his face directly at Ulster and condemns in fine satirical vein. We parade the relics of old hatred and have become like relics tainted and stained, yet still righteous for display. But the Ulster Relics is not about politics per se. It clearly deals with the conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism in Ireland, how prejudice means that they have paraded their relics, which are still righteous, in procession after procession after procession. Clearly, this repetition of 3 is not coincidental. With this religious language, Murray attempts to convey the hypocrisy of religious violence, that we nurse prejudice even at the breast, breeding guilt and hatred with religious milk. In the end, the poet laments, but to what end, to what purpose, if we are unworthy of our own children? To call this poetry a satire of political violence does not manage to grapple with the subtleties of Murray's use of religious language and his understanding of the consequences of the split of Ireland, Catholicism, and Protestantism. And that haunting question, perhaps biblical, perhaps the scrupulous reflections of an uncertain man, that whether we are unworthy of our own children. And while I unfortunately cannot mention all of the poetry I read by him in that theme of being unworthy of our children, and in the light of the scandals of the church in Ireland in the 90s, and while I would not want to put words in Father Murray's mouth, I would note a single poem called On Turning the Other Cheek, where he says, "Love's vengeance is mercy. How else explain the blow that is not returned, but instead is constrained by a love more fierce than death, and with a shuddering thrust of pain and of tenderness is aimed at the heart." This, it seems to me, is an apt lesson for dealing with the loss of perception that we face in the modern world, and how to deal with how people now perceive the matters of faith and religion, particularly in academic matters. And while for scholars to use literature in such a way as I've described to you is useless and worse, meaningless, we should see also that it is dangerous, for it is without meaning and yet perceives itself to be otherwise. It calls itself the truth, but cannot make us free. So I would perhaps conclude my paper by saying that if there is a single lesson that my fellowship taught me, and I believe the Dominicans have been trying to teach all along, it is codified in the 2 sayings on the Ruane building. And every time I walk by them on my way to class in the morning, I am reminded of my fellowship. And those 2 quotes, the first from Dante, the love which moves the sun and the other stars, and the second from John, which says that you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free, I believe I have attempted to find in my fellowship. And as a sort of postscript to what I have said, I would give you an anecdote from my time in Ireland, where I was sitting in a fish and chip shop on a main street, eating my fish and chips, and I happened to be looking out the window, and walking by was a middle-aged gentleman, working class, and as I was watching him, he stopped, crossed himself, and walked on. And here I was thinking to myself, what on earth is he doing? Because there was no church that I knew of nearby. I only later learned that there was a church 3 blocks away, but in the direct line of where the gentleman had stopped. But no one looked at him funnily for doing this. No one, started giving the sort of glances that you might get if you did that in the United States. And he clearly did not do it for other people. And I believe that is an excellent expression of the faith still in Ireland. And as a postscript to that postscript, since I've now troubled you with poetry for a good 20 minutes, I will pay back Father Rob by saying some of my own. And this is called These Noble Hills. Tell me, do the gulls still call eastward at the sea? Do silver birches lean and fall, yet waiting there for me? O heart, betray not head, to yearn a wistful song, for home is west and far to tread, and slow the years and long. So who can say when I shall see these hills, these walls, this green? But even time's quick memory cannot deprive me of the scene, for remember how the Liffey flowed, far down, deep down the wending days, and see the swans, how white they glowed, when light plays in wonders' ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. Does anyone dare ask a question? Does anyone have a question for Kate, really, about her time in Ireland? Mr. Coughlin?
They were not. They were actually taken with my family. but Father Rob told me that I had to go and have a great time, so I needed somewhere to include it.
Thank you. Yeah, there are a couple fellows who've gone off and, to the British Isles, and, and I know they've never, certainly can't be Kate's case, but we had a young man who had never tasted, alcohol. And he went to Oxford, and I told him 3 requirements, before you return. You have to punt on the River Char, you have to go to the pub and, have a beer, and you have to put on a tux and go to an Oxford College ball. I don't care what else he was going to do. He was going to complete that, and he did. I thank you all for being here. We'll gather again tomorrow evening at 7, and we're going to hear about an orphanage outside Manila in the Philippines, and we're also going to hear about 6 weeks down under, as I call it. So anyway, thank you for being here.